Our topic this morning is sensitizing our student choirs towards inclusivity. I chose that subject because I felt like it was on the cutting edge of where youth choir ministry and work is going to be headed and is already headed post-pandemic. And so if we could, let's take a moment or two in the way of an introduction on the topic. It's somewhat likely that we have a diversity of views here, opinions, and even commitments on this subject. Let me hasten to say that I myself thought very differently about the inclusivity issue, say 30, 35, or 40 years ago than I do now. I believe there are at least a couple of reasons why my view has grown and changed over the years. First, I now have really good friends, for instance, close friends, who are Roman Catholic. I have dear and treasured colleagues who are Muslim. I also have new, beautiful friends in Washington State who are Sikhs. I have a number of cherished friends, colleagues, and family members who are gay. That number seems to grow every month. At least one of the students in the San Antonio Youth Chorale is transsexual. And there's literally no telling how many Youth Q students who participate in Youth Q events are struggling mightily and secretly with their sexual orientation. I have many African American friends, Canadian friends, Mexican friends, and Irish friends. And I'll bet you do too. At least I hope you do. My world has grown immensely over the decades, and my view of God, while anchored in Jesus Christ, is much broader than it once was. Thanks be to God for that, because my childhood and teenage years were pretty narrow and pretty strict. The second reason I see things differently now than I did decades ago is because I believe my basic view of who God is has become more expansive and less provincial. Some of this has happened because I've traveled a good deal over the past few decades. Now, some would say that my loosening up shows that I'm a backslidden Christian, maybe that my faith has been watered down by society, or that I no longer take my relationship with Jesus seriously. I would beg to differ with you on that. My walk with Christ has from my youth been central to who I am. And as I've grown older, my walk with God is now very much a day by day, hour by hour relationship in which I ask God for new insights and new wisdom and the mind and heart of Christ in all that I think, say, and do. And of course, that's a constant prayer, but easier said than done. So you and I may not agree on all that's shared today, and it's unlikely that a 1 hour session at Alleluia is going to change any minds on basic theology, and that's okay. However, every one of us would have to admit that the world is changing rapidly today. And it is in the context of that rapid change, that metamorphosis, that we offer this session on inclusivity and inclusion. Our guests this morning are the director of a community student choir in Dunkirk, Maryland. It's called VIP, Voices in Praise, and they are located just southeast of Washington, D.C. We welcome to our panel today Holly Reynolds Lee. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Well, good to have you always. The music staff husband and wife team from First United Methodist Church in downtown Dallas are Dana and Tim Effler. Husband and wife. Dana is the director of music at First United Methodist, and Tim is the organist. And by the way, just parenthetically, these two friends have learned how to do every single stage of virtual choir work. They have it going on. They're the bomb. Welcome, Dana and Tim. We're glad to have you all.
Thank you. Necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing what some of us have learned to do and thought we could never do over the last, several months, few months. But we're really glad that you all are here and can add your thoughts to this time. So let me go to Holly for a moment and just ask, so to you, when you say that your student choir is inclusive, what does that term mean to you? What does that include, actually?
To me, when we talk about being inclusive, it means that it's not just an attitude, but that every policy, every procedure, every detail is designed not just to meet students where they are, but to sort of draw that circle around so that everybody's in, so that nobody's standing on the outside, nobody's on the margin. And I think if you're really going to be inclusive, it has to be done from the top down. It's a leadership commitment first and foremost, but it really does appear in ways that are absolutely invisible. Like you don't realize that they're there until you really start to think about how is my choir inclusive, and you realize that whether you meant to or not, you have sprinkled inclusion just throughout every way that you operate.
Mm-hmm. And so, Dana, what does the inclusive word mean to you and to your group?
Well, it's multidimensional. I mean, of course, we used to think of it as just racial inclusion. And downtown, since we pull from all over the Metroplex, we currently find ourselves with a fairly good mix of races within Variations Choir, and I can take no credit for that other than being a part of a church that's this open and welcoming to all. They found us, and so there's that piece of it. Of course, there's sexual orientation and sexual identity. Learning differences is something that's very important, as that I'm always aware of as a teacher. I have always had students with ADD, ADHD who don't take their medicine on the weekends. And we have to be mindful of those learning styles. We have kids who are dyslexic. And so it requires a variety of approaches. We've had students that have limited mobility, so we have to take care of those sorts of things. Is our church accessible? Is it ADA compliant? We just redid our education building, and so that all of our bathrooms are actually accessible to somebody who is in a wheelchair. Which was not the case in our building that was built in 1926. And that all of that shows compassion, and it shows a readiness to be able to receive people. Additionally, on all 3 floors of our education building, we have unisex bathrooms. So for the first time ever, we have a child in our Variations Youth Choir who began life as female and is now identifying as male. And that transition happened last year. And Julia became James. And I listened to all the kids at the beginning of the year, the boys in particular, so that I can assign them to their voice part appropriately. And I had to just be really honest with the student. And I think honest conversation is healthy. And I said, I want you to know that I affirm you and I support you, and I'm going to mess up, because there will be times that I'm going to slip up and call you Julia. And it's not because I don't accept you and don't have compassion for where you are and everything, but it's because I've known you as Julia your whole life. So I'm going to try, and we're going to try together to get through this. But I bring that up because if we didn't have the unisex restrooms, that could be a real problem. We don't like to think about things like that. But as Holly said, it has to inform all your decisions,
Right.
even basic needs.
Wow, that's good. That's a mouthful of good information there that we were hearing. And Tim, I want us to just back off a little bit here and ask the question of you, why do you think it is so important for us to move towards greater inclusivity in this world, post-pandemic 2021?
Yeah.
Why do we need to do that?
Wow. My first response is, why not?
Yeah.
And if we are and we haven't, why have we waited so long? Dana and I were talking about it. It really goes back to your personal theology and where you're coming from. But I think just given the atmosphere of the past year and of our current social and political climate, just what kids are hearing every day in the news, how incredibly polarized groups within the country are, the fact that many of them have been isolated for the past year and a half. I think all of that is really important in that we offer a place where we say, you know what? You may be different than this person. These 3 people may be different than these 4 people, but you know what? We can come together in this one loving fellowship environment where everybody's welcome, and we recognize each other's differences, but we're all here to do the same thing. We're all here. We have a unity of purpose. We have a unity of mission. And so in that way, I think our student choirs can be a great example to our bigger community, to the world, about how this can be done, how we can live together as different people and yet still have a unity of purpose, a goal to which we're all working, and that we support each other in that work.
Wow, that's a beautiful answer. So let's we've dipped our toe in here a little bit. Maybe we're up to the knee. Let's go in a little deeper and ask the question, would God have us to be inclusive of all students? And I mean all. And if so, what's your reasoning for that, Holly?
I don't think there is anything more like Christ than welcoming everybody. And not just welcoming him hey, y'all can come on in. That's not enough. It's really going out and saying, hey, please come in. I'd love to meet you. It's not enough to just open the door and say, hey, you can all come here and do this thing. What we have to do is really to follow that biblical model, which is to go and be in that corner of the world, to work to enter into that community and to minister from there. When I think of youth choir, I always think of it kind of as these concentric circles where the kids who've been with you for a long time, they're kind of right in the center. They're right with you right here. And, it's easy as the directors for us just to stay there and not really see past. but we are compelled to move our feet, to walk through those levels of circles, to help turn around those kids in the inside and say, are you seeing what's going on in the outer rings? Are you seeing who's there and what do we need to do? And it's about us moving to them. I think so often in ministry, we have a great program and we all say everybody's welcome, but it's just not enough. You can't just say you can come here. You actually have to go and do the hard work of relationship building and ministry building. And I think that is exactly what Christ did time and time again throughout his life, much to the surprise of the disciples and other people. They're like, how is he doing that? But that's really, if we're going to follow a model, let's follow that one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dana, how about you?
Well, I mean, I think it all goes back to theology, really. I mean, you touched on it earlier. Holly's touching on it right now. I mean, what do we believe? I mean, do we believe that God is love and that love is unconditional? Or do we believe really that God is more punitive than loving? I mean, I think Jesus showed us the way of inclusion. Jesus came, to show us what God's love was like in human form. And, if we follow the example of Jesus, we love and include like Jesus did, invite everybody to the wedding feast. And I want to just state kind of the obvious here is if we go back to a feeling level, though, a human feeling level, and move out of that heady space where theology is, and we come to a more personal space, I think we have to, before compassion can really grow in us, I think we have to own the feelings that we have that are a barrier to our compassion and our connecting with a student who makes us feel uncomfortable. We know we're supposed to love everybody, and so we say we do, but we fail to really realize that little part of us that's really judging them, so that we can feel more safe. If I could put them in that box, and then I can be over here on my holy mountain. But we have to, I think, first own those feelings that we don't like to own. That, like, I'm uncomfortable that I have a Julia that is now a James, and I'm going to mess up his name, and I think we have to deal with that on a human level, and to know that it's there, and to know that that's what humans do, and that that's okay, before we can begin to work with it and deal with it and become more real in our attempts to be inclusive. Maybe that's too much self-disclosure.
No, that's great. That's great. I was doing a QCast interview not long ago with an African American friend who is a voice teacher in California, and we were asking the question. I asked the question of her to tell us from the African American community what we white people need to hear. What do you need us to hear from you? And she told us some very important things, and some things that were probably hard to say, and some things that were hard to hear, but they had the ring of truth about it. And I sort of, in a self-disclosing moment, said to her, I said, Melissa, I have to admit that I struggle, and have since my early years, with just a racism that pops into my head before I even have a chance to filter it. It's just there. And she said back to me, she said, if you're a human being, you have biases.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the way it is.
Sure.
And for us to make statements about ourselves, well, I'm not a racist, I'm not biased, is is a kind of blindness,
Yeah.
because we all have that.
Yeah.
And it may not be just about race, it may be about the way a person is shaped, or the way the person
Mm-hmm.
talks, or the way, or that person's theology. It could be all kinds of things. But the first step is to admit that we have those fears and that we have that insecurity. I'm gonna ask you, Tim, if you would talk to us for a minute. Your student choir context is there at First United Methodist in downtown Dallas. That's your context. Talk to me for a minute. Talk to us about a little more about that context. What kind of commitment toward inclusion has your church made over the years?
Mm. Um, we like to think we're very inclusive. Again, we've taken some steps, particularly with our current senior minister, who has been with us now for 8 years. Right.
Almost.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is very much concerned with that, and we're paying lots of attention, particularly just in the past couple of years, about our messaging, to make sure that we get the word out that we want to get out. In other words, examining what that commitment is to inclusion, and making sure that we're expressing that in a way that portrays us the way we feel we are, the way we're seeking to be. And as Dana said, um, we have some built-in diversity in our choir and in our church, simply because of what we have decided we're going to be. In other words, I think that people have come to us in such a way that it has created some diversity that we didn't try to create. It created itself because we put the message out. Here's a place where you're welcome. Here's a place where you are invited to come be a part of this congregation, and this faith group, this group of believers, who, as Dana said, I think it's so important that we're willing to say, we're going to screw up, guys. You're welcome here. We want you to be a part of what's going on here. And we're not always going to get it right, but we want you to know that it's important to us to be inclusive, and it's important to us. It's a commitment on our part to be inclusive and to include everyone we can, even if we screw up. And we're going to screw up. And the key to that is staying in those honest conversations with people. Just like you're saying you did with the voice teacher, to just be able to say, I don't know. I don't know everything about you or your life or where you're coming from or your point of view, because it may be very different from mine. But we're willing to do that. And I think Dana and I, within the music and arts program, have always sought to be inclusive. And we're quite blessed, honestly, to be a part of a church that is on the same wavelength in that regard. And
Wow.
but it's a commitment, and it's a being willing to say to people, I'm committed to do this.
I like no, I don't like, I really love the whole thing of you're saying to the kids on the outset, we're not going to get this perfectly right. This is kind of new to all of us, and there are a lot of different things where, not a lot of different places where we can make a mistake or say the wrong thing. But But the beauty of it is that we can say, rest assured that the mistake is an error of the head and not of the heart, because we really do want you to be among us. How about you, Holly? Your context is considerably different, because although you are connected in some ways to a church, in that they provide you your rehearsal space and all of that, you are a community youth choir. You're your own entity, your own 501c3. I feel a kinship to you because our San Antonio Youth Chorale is also in that category. So with that context, how do you, and kind of answer this question too, is do you think that everyone in your community choir, including parents, are all aboard the diversity philosophy?
No, I don't think they are. We are in an area where we have a very wide political spectrum, and in it, I think there's a lot that divides us. And I think what Tim said about having a unity of purpose is just critical for a youth choir. I think one of the things that is divisive, an area where division occurs, is actually areas of faith. In our community youth choir, we have students from at least a dozen totally different churches: Lutheran, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, Catholic, and 30 to 40% of our kids don't have a church home, some of whom have never been to church. So we often end up with kids sometimes feeling like they're not Christian enough, or they're not churchy enough, compared to some of their peers. And so we sort of have to work to be really careful about how we include, even to the point of realizing that sometimes when we're participating in worship, there are kids who don't know the Lord's Prayer. There are kids who didn't grow up kind of doing, we get in a place where you can't see the forest for the trees, and we really have to see both the trees and the forest. Yeah. And I think for us, what we really work to do is to just make it a space where we present that unity of purpose, but also we talk about the way that God works. I once had a parent say to me, "I can't believe you would let a student go on tour. I don't think she's a Christian."
Oh, God.
And I said, okay. And the challenge was maybe only kids who are Christians should get certain opportunities. And it came from a parent that I love and respect, and a Christian to whom I am in relationship with and, have known for a long time. And I sort of said, I don't know how God works at all times, in all places, in all people. So I am certainly not going to be the one to take an opportunity from a student. And when I'm confronted with those types of attitudes, what I always say is, I think of our students like stained glass windows, that God does not need their permission or their blessing to shine through them to create something beautiful. Huh. And I don't think it's my job to really question those things, to accept that we're all a work in progress. I'm grateful for my little role that God trusts me with for students for the time that they're with us. But I feel like we have to let God do his job, and recognize what belongs to him and what is his and not ours. So it is not my job specifically to convert or to pledge or to do all these things. It's my job to talk about what a loving and gracious and wonderful God I serve, and allow God to work. So I think sometimes we have to really position it to let God work and not get in the way. So when it comes to having a community choir, really, I take that approach, that God is at work in everyone and through us as a group. And together, I think we do great things. And we just have to be mindful that we are different. But I trust that God has brought everyone to us for a reason, and that he's always working it for his good at all times. That was a lot.
Yeah, well, that's a lot, and it's a lot of good. So specifically, how does your commitment to inclusivity, how does it flesh itself out, say, in a rehearsal?
Mm-hmm.
When a person comes in, how does that inclusivity play itself out for the students? I'm going to start with Tim on that one.
Well, I'll say a couple of things, then I'd like to punt to Dana because I think she's done some really great things.
Okay. She's going to be next.
Okay. Well, as Holly said earlier, it filters out into everything you do. And I totally 110% agree with it's a top-down thing. As one of our friends likes to say, a lot of our kids, their BS meter's not broken yet. And so if we're not being honest, and they're watching us, they're watching what we do, they're listening to every word we say, they watch how we treat each other, they watch how we treat other students. And that is everything down to what goes on in a rehearsal each week. And like I say, I'd love to just punt to Dana to discuss some of the specific things she's put into place to make that happen.
Yeah, and Dana, we'll ask you that in just a couple of minutes. What you were saying about they're watching us. They're watching us even when they're not watching us.
Yeah.
Because it's seeping through their pores. It's the whole ambiance of that rehearsal feeling and sense of atmosphere is seeping through their pores in ways that they don't even understand or realize. Dana, what specifically comes to your mind as ways that you all keep that inclusive thing going just in the daily life of the student choir?
Well, first, in my rehearsals, singers are singers. And our purpose is to make music. So regardless, we're all coming there for the same reason. We want to make music together. And so that's a unifier right there. And because it's a unifier, everybody's included in that, regardless of how you get there, or where you started from. Last year, we had to do part of our rehearsals on Zoom, and I used that big air rehearsals for Zoom sessions. We started the beginning of that about talking about the ABCs of variations. What is the ABCs of variations for everybody who's listening who has no idea what I'm talking about? That's the name of our youth choir. And the ABCs tell us what variations is about. And the acronym stands for affirmation, beauty, and collaboration. So there's this overarching theme or guiding principles, if you will, that kind of plug into in all that we do. We affirm each other for being there. We're there to create beauty, and we see the beauty in and through each other in the music we're making. And of course, it's a collaborative effort. So, just having that sort of overarching 10,000-foot view, I think is a unifier and an includer at the level of ideal and philosophy. And then on a real practical level, I agree with what Holly said. I think inclusion and welcome starts at the top. And I model that for our kids, making no apologies is just a spirit of welcome. And I challenge our choir officers and specifically our senior class to do the same thing. Of what Holly was saying, circle outward, and helping them to model that same thing, because I can model it all day long, but it will never have the same impact as a well-respected senior in the program, modeling that same sort of welcome and inclusion. So I set up those kinds of systems and try to provide for each student.
Yeah, wonderful. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to get to a couple of more questions. And so as I put these questions to you, Holly and Dana especially, try to do bullet points if you can, without a whole lot of explanation. And the question is, how do you manage the complexity of travel in an inclusive group of students? I know, Holly, you travel with your group. You're taking them to Alaska next summer if all continues to go well. Dana, you've been on your way with your group to England a couple of times. Hopefully that will work out for you next year or sometime after the pandemic. And so you deal with those things. So be thinking about that for just a moment. And I'm going to go back to Tim here for just a minute. Is there anything generally that you would like to say to us about this whole subject that maybe we haven't covered today, or just to underline and emphasize something important that has come about?
Yeah, I think for me, I think we can get the cause of whatever our the political world's dealing with, or whatever maybe our individual churches or institutions are dealing with. We sometimes get really swept up in the big issues and being inclusive about the things we're hearing about on a daily basis in the news. But inclusion is inclusion, and all means all. And that can be everything from, I'm struggling with depression, or my parents just got a divorce. It can be anything. And I think it's our job to just remember that when we're seeking to be inclusive, we're inclusive of all of God's people, because they're all beloved children of God, period.
Wow, wonderful. Dana, let's go to you. Give us some bullet points of how you handle the complexity of travel.
We've had students who were openly gay, and that with the rooming situation, in one case, we made early on in 1996. I made some of the worst decisions just trying to deal with, things that before we had anyway, I won't go into that, but it's just like trying to figure out what to do, and you want well, and it's difficult, especially in these situations. We've been blessed on some of the situations because gay students were also siblings, so they roomed with their sibling. In one of the situations, it was just a frank conversation with one who actually came out of the closet during the senior banquet as part of her closing speech. It was eye-opening. But anyway, she had a close family friend who also was a member of the choir, had a conversation with both families. Everybody was okay. So that's what we did moving forward. And do I wish I had the perfect answer for this. But as far as our transgender student, I have no idea what we're going to do this year. But I know that it's going to start with honest conversations with the student, with parents, with ministers, and we're gonna approach it that way. And I'll come back and let you know what we figure out.
Yeah, and isn't it true that all of this needs to begin with honest conversation. How is it that we have felt like that we could institute stuff that would take care of all of our problems when really what we need to do is just sit down and talk, figure it out, work it out? That takes time. That's a hassle. But it also gives us opportunity to build stronger relationships and friendships with those students as we do that. I love your answer, Dana. That's good. Good. How about you, Holly?
I think that it all starts before we go on tour, because we're really lucky that I have a great leadership team. And one of the things they're passionate about is mixing up our group. So you might get on the bus and order from tallest to shortest by birth month. You're going to spend an hour sitting on the bus next to somebody you've never talked to before. When we gather for fellowship dinner, she assigns them to tables. Sometimes it's random, sometimes it's intentional. Everybody who prefers chocolate cake over ice cream sundaes sits here, but she's working throughout the whole year to make them make other connections, which strengthens the group. But when it comes to tour, we have a paper that I created years ago that has served us so well, and I didn't mean for it to. It was an accident, truly. But when we do our group and rooming assignments, your group is a mixed gender, mixed age group. Your rooming is always same gender. But it lets them list 4 people they want in their room and 2 people they don't. And there's a place that says, is there anything you want Holly to know? I love open-ended questions on these forms because often the kids will share information. So what that form tells me, it tells me a lot, more than my students realize, and I pray that none of my students ever watch this video. In the course of my history, if you put somebody on your I don't want to room with them list, I meet that need every time. And if I ever can't, if there's a logistics, I'll have a conversation. So when we have students who are working through issues about gender and sexuality, usually the choir knows, the students know. So if there's a concern, it comes out that way. But the other thing this form does, there's always 1 or 2 students that everybody wants to room with. There's always like 1 or 2 that are just your connectors. So if there's a kid on the fringes, a kid who has not been listed a lot, I put those 2 together, trusting that my kid with all the social cred is going to pull along the kid who maybe needs a little bit more. But really, and because we now have parents sign off on that form, it says, I want a room with so-and-so. My parents are okay with it. Please put me here. And by honoring the I don't want a room with requests, I feel like I have answered everyone without having a conversation with everyone. 9 times out of 10, the I don't want a room with them requests are just normal teenage things. Like I've had girls say, my friend talks too much. She's up all night. I want to go to sleep. She's my good friend, but please don't room me with her. Okay, it's a practical reason. But even if they're not practical, it allows us to create a space where people are comfortable. And I think that there's something about being inclusive. Sometimes you have to be loud, but sometimes you can be inclusive quietly. You can have honest conversations quietly. And that allows it to not feel, you don't ever want to shame a kid. You don't ever want a kid to feel like there's a spotlight on them in a negative way. And I think having a paper like that lets you just gather intel, so then you know what to do with it. Then you've got what you need to have conversations and make decisions for the good of your group. Wow.
Tim and Holly and Dana, thank you all so much for joining us. This has been very, very good, very enlightening and interesting. I'm going to ask that we spend just a moment in prayer as we continue our day. And those of you who have joined us in the class, we are glad that you're here, although we can't see you. We know you're there, and we're grateful for that. So let's pray together, shall we? Holy, loving God, we are grateful that you have included us. And we pray that you would help us to know how to include our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, those people who are very different from us. Help us to not in any way withhold the love that you have given to us from them. We pray that you would give us wisdom, that you would give us courage, that you would give us insights, but most of all, that you would fill us with your spirit of love as we touch the students under our care. It's our prayer in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.